The civil rights movement has a long history with many different leaders, participants, places, and events. Categorize the terms from the list in the middle into the correct boxes. You will learn about all of these items in this lesson. This image is from the March on Washington in 1963. Isn't that discrimination? Discrimination happens when one group is treated differently from another. Segregation happens when one group is kept separate from another group. Both of these happen when there is prejudice or intolerance. You will often hear these words when people talk about the way African Americans have been treated in our country. We shall overcome. African Americans and others have always resisted prejudice. But the Jim Crow laws that allowed legal discrimination against African Americans might still exist today if it wasn't for the hard work of people in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. During that time, people joined together, organized, and protested more than ever before. New laws were passed, other laws were declared unconstitutional, and things started to change in people's everyday lives. A non-violent sit-in at a whites-only lunch counter in Oklahoma City, okay. Separate drinking fountains for colored and white people. The people who changed things, civil rights movers and shakers. The civil rights movement was made up of many well-known people as well as political groups and ordinary citizens. They all stood up to intimidation, violence, and threat of arrest. Even kids and teenagers got involved. Martin Luther King, Jr. helped found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. He delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington. Malcolm X promoted black independence, self-defense, and human rights. He often disagreed with the non-violent methods of King. Medgar Evers was a civil rights activist who investigated cases for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, NAACP, and helped James Meredith integrate the University of Mississippi. The Little Rock Nine integrated their all-white high school in 1957. A third grader named Linda Brown helped change the laws about school segregation. Change starts with forcing people to pay attention. Activists used a variety of strategies to end racial discrimination. Like Martin Luther King, Jr., many activists chose to use peaceful or non-violent methods to call attention to the problem and pressure the government to change. Other people, like Malcolm X, thought civil rights would have to be gained through any means necessary, even violence. Both approaches influenced the civil rights movement by calling attention to the discrimination African Americans faced on a daily basis. Marches involved large groups of protesters taking to the streets with signs, banners, songs, and chants. Sit-ins were a way to integrate, bring the races together, a business or public area. African Americans would sit at whites-only areas and wait to be served. Boycotts called for consumers to avoid a product or service that discriminated against African Americans. Court cases challenged unfair laws. Change in the White House. It took the work of all three branches to finally protect the civil rights of African Americans and other minority groups in the United States. As the leader of the nation and the executive branch, the president holds an important role in bringing about change. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy asked for legislation giving all Americans the right to be served in facilities which are open to the public, hotels, restaurants, theaters, retail stores, and similar establishments, as well as greater protection for the right to vote. He was assassinated that same year, but the new president, Lyndon B. Johnson, helped push the bill through Congress. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 became law. Both men used their power and influence to enforce major political and social change. Change in the laws. Other changes came about when new laws were passed through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, and national origin. This includes discrimination in the workplace, public places, schools, and in voting. The 24th Amendment ended the practice of poll taxes in 1964. States and local governments could no longer charge citizens for the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits any restriction on the right to vote. This included poll tests and voter intimidation. It followed through on the promise of the 15th Amendment. Change in the courts. Many changes came when the Jim Crow laws that limited the freedoms and rights of African Americans were challenged in the courts. Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court said racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. Bailey v. Patterson. In 1962, the Supreme Court decided that it was unconstitutional for transportation facilities like bus and train stations to be racially segregated. Loving v. Virginia. In 1967, the Supreme Court decided that any state law that prohibits interracial marriage is unconstitutional. Did anyone oppose the civil rights movement? Yes. There were many different groups that fought the changes brought on by the civil rights movement. In politics, a group called the Dixiecrats worked to keep racial segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South. Many southern towns had white citizen councils that also fought to keep segregation by creating all-white schools and pushing black civil rights activists out of jobs. The most well-known group was the Ku Klux Klan, which met secretly and was responsible for acts of violence and terrorism against African Americans and white people who supported the fight for civil rights. These groups, and others, made even speaking out a very dangerous activity. Thurgood Marshall represented the Brown family in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. He became the first African American justice on the Supreme Court in 1967. What's the message? Marches, protests, sit-ins, and boycotts all have one thing in common: signs. Match the problem solution cards with the correct protest sign. Prior to 1956, 17 states required all schools to be segregated by race. State and local laws punished teachers in integrated schools with fines and even jail time. Many African Americans were turned away from registering to vote and from polling places. They had to pay poll taxes and take impossible tests. They faced threats of violence, false arrest, and beatings by local police and groups like the KKK. The Fair Housing Act was passed as a part of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. It prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing, loans, of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, gender, marriage status, and disability. In 1964, the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. A year later, the Voting Rights Act banned discrimination at voting booths nationwide. African Americans were discriminated against when they tried to buy or rent a home. They also had trouble getting loans to purchase big-ticket items like houses. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that the idea of separate but equal was not constitutional. Therefore, laws calling for racial segregation of schools were unconstitutional. Prior to 1956, Prior to 1956, 17 states required all schools to be segregated by race. State and local laws punished teachers in integrated schools with fines and even jail time. Many African Americans were turned away from registering to vote and from polling places. They had to pay poll taxes and take impossible tests. They faced threats of violence, false arrest, and beatings by local police and groups like the KKK. The Fair Housing Act was passed as a part of the 1968 Civil Rights Act. It prohibits discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing, loans, of housing based on race, color, national origin, religion, gender, marriage status, and disability. In 1964, the 24th Amendment outlawed poll taxes. A year later, the Voting Rights Act banned discrimination at voting booths nationwide. African Americans were discriminated against when they tried to buy or rent a home. They also had trouble getting loans to purchase big-ticket items like houses. In Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that the idea of separate but equal was not constitutional. Therefore, laws calling for racial segregation of schools were unconstitutional. SB vocabulary. Match the word with its definition. 1. Activist. 2. Segregation. 3. Nonviolent. 4. Discrimination. 5. I walk to my summer job with my brother 6 days a week. Last summer, we rode the bus, and it only took us 15 minutes. Now we walk 4 miles each way. It takes over an hour, but it is important for us all to send a message. The bus company needs to know that we do not support segregated seating and discrimination. 3. My feet hurt. We are on day 3 of our 4-day walk from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. We travel about 12 miles a day and sleep in the fields alongside the road. It isn't easy, but we sing songs and meet other people as we walk. Our goal is to get the state and federal politicians to help blacks vote in the South. We hope that having over 25,000 in our group will get their attention and make change. 4. A bunch of my friends from college and I joined other students and drove to the South to get African Americans to register to vote. Many were scared because groups like the KKK had been beating up people when they went to the polling places. If a boss found out that his black employee was registered to vote, he'd fire him. We went down to educate them about their rights and support them so they would get out and vote. 2. It was scary, but we sat down at the lunch counter and waited to be served. It wasn't fair that this diner refused to serve blacks, and we decided to sit at the counter until they did serve us. We didn't make a scene, didn't yell, didn't break stuff. We just sat there and waited. Angry people came up and hit us, yelled in our faces, and even dumped a milkshake on my friend's head. But we stayed. After 3 straight days, the diner finally decided to serve us. Source: Smithsonian Copyright 2019 iCivics. Rosa Parks is arrested after refusing to give up her seat to whites on a public bus. A local Baptist minister, Martin Luther King, Jr., leads a year-long bus boycott that results in a U.S. Supreme Court case requiring bus desegregation. Jackson, Mississippi, May 1961. The Congress for Racial Equality, CORE, organizes freedom rides across the Deep South. Members integrate interstate buses and bus stops from D.C. to Mississippi. The participants meet with violent mobs, and many CORE members are jailed along the way. Atlanta, Georgia, February 1957. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, developed out of the Montgomery bus boycott. It was founded by 60 black ministers, including Martin Luther King, Jr. It is still run out of its original offices in Atlanta. Washington, D.C. August 28, 1963. More than 250,000 people gather on the Mall during the peaceful March on Washington. This event was organized by the NAACP and other civil rights groups. Martin Luther King, Jr. delivers his I Have a Dream speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Selma, Alabama, March 1965. 600 marchers calling for voting rights are stopped and assaulted by police officers and others on the outskirts of Selma. Martin Luther King, Jr. leads a second march and seeks court protection for an even larger march. The demonstrators win, and up to 25,000 marched from Selma to Montgomery, sleeping in fields as they make the 4-day trek. Memphis, Tennessee, April 4, 1968. Martin Luther King, Jr. is shot and killed while standing on the balcony of his hotel. King was in town to support black sanitation workers who were on strike in the city. The geography of civil rights. Use a map to help you find these important locations of the civil rights movement. Write the correct number next to each star on the map.